As the first European to understand the need, quote unquote, to use the canoe to access the interior of the northern half of the continent, Champlain, for Jennings, established a new frontier above the other North American frontiers, the agricultural frontier of the American settlements and the frontier of the horse in the southern states in Mexico. While these two frontiers were based upon an acquisition of land, the geographic realities of the northern portion of the continent made land not so much the desirable objects. Instead, Jennings argues, while it lasted, the canoe frontier set itself apart from all others in the Western world. Unlike the frontiers of the settler and the horse, the frontier did not covet the land, only its bounty. Native peoples were not pushed aside, but they were wooed as partners in a very lucrative trade. Central to this partnership for Jennings was the unique social dynamics of the canoe. James Raffin, the current head of the Canadian Canoe Museum, argues for a similar value of the canoe, where he says the canoe's form and function are set by the parameters of the natural materials from which they are made and derived from the essence of the Canadian landscape and its First Nations. A canoe ties its paddlers to the waters and to the landscape, but it also ties them to each other in significant ways. So both Raffin and Jennings see this intimacy as being central not only to the historical relationship in the canoe, but also to the contemporary national relationships of tolerance and diversity. So Jennings writes, in effect, the officials of New France established policies of racial tolerance and respect on the frontier that were later adopted by English and Scottish traders of the Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company, eventually leading them to the Northwest Mounted Police when they brought law and order to the Plains region of the new Canadian state. In this logic, Canada's multiculturalism for Jennings comes in a direct line from the impassable forest and rapids of the St. Lawrence watershed. That canoeing established a policy of multiculturalism that then kind of dominoed its way through the Canadian state. Of course, I think this is actually a rather tenuous assertion on Jennings' part, for if there is a line between the canoe and the ideal of multiculturalism currently in Canada, then that line passed not only through the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Mounted Police, but also through years of land theft, indifference to widespread disease in Aboriginal communities, through policies of assimilation, through racist immigration practices, and through continued indifference to First Nations communities in need. So here we can start to unravel some of the historical assumptions in this narrative of the canoe as a vehicle ontologically designed for cooperation. In the chapter this comes from, I take some more time to do this as a kind of look back at the historical record to kind of see how essentially the social relations in this canoe frontier centered around both cooperation and conflict, what Richard White has called the middle ground of North America, where there was a kind of long and significant struggle for control over territory in which neither First Nations or European groups had an upper hand, but they required a kind of strange dynamic of cooperation and conflict. Neither were wholeheartedly embracing the other as friends and allies, but they also couldn't deal without each other. So there was this kind of interesting dynamic. Raffin and Jennings, on the other hand, personalized the dynamic of social contact and the relationships of power in these canoes. When Jennings argues that the canoe provides this forced intimacy that necessitated a new form of colonialism, he assumes that the colonial relationship will reflect those interpersonal relationships of the canoe. In fact, there's plenty to show that actually even paddling in a canoe, you didn't have to be friends, you just had to be able to paddle in different ways. So, what does this tell us about the reenactments, or what can we read in the reenactments from this kind of pedagogical history? In the articulation of the canoe as an intimate connection to both the land and the nation, we find a clear historical narrative placing the canoe as the founding vehicle of the modern Canadian nation. In the reenactments that I turn to, this foundation is presented specifically in the perseverance in the face of a wild and unfamiliar space, and as such, they mobilize that logic of forced intimacy, where Canada is delivered in the experience of suffering through nature. That is, that the ability to sort of engage with and live through and survive through nature becomes a kind of a historical leap between the voyageurs and the modern paddlers. The nation exists in these trips as something encountered by the original European travelers through the canoe. And it is this particular encounter that they often try to recreate in the journeys, right? This is a very environmental determinist kind of framework where Canada was kind of waiting in the trees and rivers of North America for somebody to discover it. And it just happened to be Europeans. While this character of the encounter is often slightly different from trip to trip, what remains consistent through these narratives is the ability for the canoe to access the true spirit of the nation in the same way their idealized predecessors did. So that means, essentially, it doesn't matter what kind of ideas about Canadian identity these paddlers have. They could be different. One could be more multicultural, one could be more sort of European-based. But all of them take that kind of foundation, that environmental foundation of the nation as central. And so in order to get to the character of the nation, they need to interact with the land of the nation. And this connection, nature plays a key role, as it is through the landscape that these modern-day voyageurs find their history. The land provides a link back to the experience of the early travelers, such that the simple act of passing over the same portage or camping on the same patch of grass offers a parallel experience, one which is integral to understanding the development and foundation of the nation. So let me give you a couple examples from these reenactments here. So paddling on the Ottawa River, Joni and Gary McGuffin looked for the original portages of Northwest Company voyageurs. Most of these had been flooded by hydro development or paved by residential communities, yet they do succeed from time to time. One time, they write, as always, when we discovered an original path, we became very excited. An unmistakable trail had been etched in the ancient bedrock by hundreds of thousands of load-bearing footsteps. Through eyes that squinted against the salty sweat trickling from overheated brows, we envisaged ahead of us on that trail ghostly images of short, stocky voyageurs hunched and straining beneath bulky loads. Slowly and steadily, we completed the portage, then forged against the icy spring-fed current. The same experience is recorded by Max Finkelstein just beyond the Ottawa on the Mattawa River. I slip on the same rocks that they did, wade through equally cold, icy water, just like they did, sweat and freeze at the same time on the portage around the falls. Climbing up the Pigeon River, just coming out of Lake Superior and moving west, John Donaldson describes one portage. Most of this bone-jarring climb was through deep mud. At one point, with the canoe on my back, my feet slid underneath me. As I lay prostrate, the weight forced my face into the mud. As it oozed into my eyes, mouth, and ears, the winged devils swooped in for their feast. Finally, I was able to push the canoe to the side and ease myself out. This portage qualified as inclusion as one of Dante's 7 circles of hell. No wonder the voyageurs used to say that it was easier to climb to heaven than to Pigeon Lake. All at once, I realized that the light was fading. Since I had set out before dawn, the whole day, from sunup to sundown, about 18 hours, had been spent stumbling, falling, and cursing the mosquitoes along this trail to hell. These comparisons of experience assert a kind of timelessness to the landscape, an unchanging struggle provided by the harsh land. I sweat and slip the same as they did. I understand why they called this portage the way they did, and so on. And given the historical frame in which these discussions are happening as an encounter with the nation, the timelessness of the landscape speaks to a kind of implicit origin to the nation itself. And the canoe forms an important part of discovering this origin because it provides the mode of access. It is not merely enough to be in the landscape. You can't just get flown in and dropped off and put in somebody's cottage, but rather you have to work to be in the landscape and work in particular ways to be in the landscape, right? Canoes are privileged here because they mimic the challenge, suffering, and sacrifice endured by these so-called founders of the nation. Notice here the focus on hardships throughout the comparisons to the path of the voyageurs in the previous quotations. Voyageurs straining beneath hunched loads, slipping on rocks, ascending into hell. At the end of his climb, Donaldson remarks, I was tired, hungry, aching in every muscle, badly bitten and mud-caked, but I was not defeated. I could now truly identify with the hardships of Mackenzie and his intrepid voyageurs 2 centuries earlier.